Book 1, Chapter 4 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex E. Talander, Davis, California. The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H. G. Wells. Book 1, Chapter 4. The Giant Children. 1. For a time at least, the spreading circle of residual consequences about the experimental farm must pass out of the focus of our narrative. How for a long time a power of bigness, in fungus and toadstool, in grass and weed, radiated from that charred but not absolutely obliterated centre. Nor can we tell here at any length how these mournful spinsters, the two surviving hens, made a wonder of and a show, spent their remaining years in eggless celebrity. The reader who is hungry for fuller details in these matters is referred to the newspapers of the period, to the voluminous, indiscriminate files of the modern recording angel. Our business lies with Mr. Bensington at the focus of the disturbance. He had come back to London to find himself a quite terribly famous man. In a night the whole world had changed with respect to him. Everybody understood. Cousin Jane, it seemed, knew all about it. The people in the streets knew all about it. The newspapers all and more. To meet Cousin Jane was terrible, of course, but when it was over not so terrible after all. The good woman had limits even to her power of facts. It was clear that she had communed with herself and accepted the food as something in the nature of things. She took the line of huffy dutifulness. She disapproved highly, it was evident, but she did not prohibit. The flight of Bensington, as she must have considered it, may have shaken her, and her worst was to treat him with bitter persistence for a cold he had not caught, and fatigue he had long since forgotten, and to buy him a new sort of hygienic all-wool combination underwear, that was apt to get involved and turn partially inside out and partially not, and as difficult to get into for an absent-minded man as society. And so for a space, and as far as his convenience left him leisure, he still continued to participate in the development of this new element in human history, the food of the gods. The public mind, following its own mysterious laws of selection, had chosen him as the one and only responsible inventor and promoter of this new wonder. It would hear nothing of Redwood, and without a protest it allowed Cossar to follow his natural impulse into a terribly prolific obscurity. Before he was aware of the drift of these things, Mr. Bensington was, so to speak, stark and dissected upon the hoardings. His baldness, his curious general pinkness, and his golden spectacles had become a national possession. Resolute young men with large expensive-looking cameras and a general air of complete authorization took possession of the flat for brief but fruitful periods, let off flashlights in that they filled it for days with dense, intolerable vapour, and retired to fill the pages of the syndicated magazines with their admirable photographs of Mr. Bensington, complete and at home in his second-best jacket and his slashed shoes. Other resolute-mannered persons of various ages and sexes dropped in and told him things about boom food. It was Punch first called the stuff boom food, and afterwards reproduced what they had said as his own original contribution to the interview. The thing became quite an obsession with Broadbeam, the popular humorist. He scented another confounded thing he could not understand, and he fretted dreadfully in his efforts to laugh the thing down. One saw him in clubs, a great clumsy presence with the evidences of his midnight oil burning manifest upon his large unwholesome face, explained to every one he could buttonhole. "These scientific chaps, you know, haven't a sense of humour, you know. That's what it is. This science. Kills it." He jests at Bensington became malignant libels. An enterprising press-cutting agency sent Bensington a long article about himself from a sixpenny weekly, entitled "A New Terror," and offered to supply 100 such disturbances for a guinea, and two extremely charming young ladies, totally unknown to him, called, and to the speechless indignation of Cousin Jane, had tea with him and afterwards sent him their birthday books for his signature. He was speedily quite hardened to seeing his name associated with the most incongruous ideas in the public press, and to discover in the reviews articles written about boom food, and himself in a tone of the utmost intimacy by people he had never heard of, and whatever delusions he may have cherished in the days of his obscurity about the pleasantness of fame were dispelled utterly and forever. At first, except for Broadbeam, the tone of the public mind was quite free from any touch of hostility. It did not seem to occur to the public mind as anything but a mere playful supposition that any more Heracleophobia was going to escape again, and it did not seem to occur to the public mind that the growing little band of babies now being fed on the food would presently be growing more up than most of us ever grow. The sort of thing that pleased the public mind was caricatures of eminent politicians after a course of boom feeding, uses of the ideas on hoardings, and such edifying exhibitions as the dead wasps that had escaped the fire and the remaining hens. Beyond that the public did not care to look, until very strenuous efforts were made to turn its eyes to the remoter consequences, and even then for a while its enthusiasm for action was partial. "There's always something new," said the public, a public so glutted with novelty that it would hear of the earth being split as one splits an apple, without surprise, and "I wonder what they'll do next." But there were one or two people outside the public, as it were, who did already take that further glance, and some it seems were frightened by what they saw there. There was young Caterham, for example, cousin of the Earl of Pewterstone, and one of the most promising of English politicians, who, taking the risk of being thought a faddist, wrote a long article in the 19th Century and After, to suggest its total suppression, and, in certain of his moods, there was Bensington. "They don't seem to realize," he said to Cossar. "No, they don't. And do we? Sometimes, when I think of what it means, this poor child of redwoods, and of course you are 40 feet high, perhaps. After all, ought we to go on with it?" "Go on with it!" cried Cossar, convulsed with inelegant astonishment, and pitching his note higher than ever. "Of course you'll go on with it! What do you think you were made for? Just to loaf about between meal times?" "Serious consequences!" he screamed. "Of course! Enormous! Obviously! Why, man, it's the only chance you'll ever get of a serious consequence, and you want to shirk it!" For a moment his indignation was speechless. "It's downright wicked!" he said at last, and repeated explosively, "Wicked!" But Bensington worked in his laboratory now with more emotion than zest. He couldn't tell whether he wanted serious consequences to his life or not. He was a man of quiet taste. It was a marvellous discovery, of course, quite marvellous, but he had already become the proprietor of several acres of scorched, discredited property near Hickley Brow, at a price of nearly £90 an acre, and at times he was disposed to think it as serious a consequence of speculative chemistry as any unambitious man could wish. Of course he was famous, terribly famous; more than satisfying, altogether more than satisfying, was the fame he had attained. But the habit of research was strong on him, and at moments, rare moments in the laboratory chiefly, he would find something else than habit and Cossar's arguments to urge him to his work. This little spectacled man, poised perhaps with his slashed shoes wrapped about the legs of his high stool, and his hand upon the tweezer of his balanced weights, would have again a flash of that adolescent vision, would have a momentary perception of the eternal unfolding of the seed that had been sown in his brain, would see as it were in the sky, behind the grotesque shapes and accidents of the present, the coming world of giants, and all the mighty things the future was in store, vague and splendid, like some glittering palace seen suddenly in the passing of a sunbeam far away; and presently it would be with him as though that distant splendour had never shone upon his brain, and he would perceive nothing ahead but sinister shadows, vast declivities and darknesses, inhospitable immensities, cold, wild, and terrible things. 2. Amidst the complex and confused happenings, the impacts from the great outer world that constituted Mr. Bensington's frame, as shining and active a figure presently became conspicuous, became almost, as it were, a leader and marshal of these externalities in Mr. Bensington's eyes. This was Dr. Winkles, that convincing young practitioner, who has already appeared in this story as the means whereby Redwood was able to convey the food to his son. Even before the great outbreak, it was evident that the mysterious powders Redwood had given him had awakened this gentleman's interest immensely, and so soon as the first wasp came he was putting two and two together. He was the sort of doctor that is in manners, in morals, in methods and appearance, most succinctly and finally expressed by the word rising. He was large and fair, with a hard, alert, superficial, aluminum-coloured eye, and hair like chalk mud, even-featured and muscular about the clean-shaven mouth, erect in figure and energetic in movement, quick in spinning on the heel, and he wore long frock coats, black silk ties, and plain gold studs and chains, and his silk hats had a special shape and brim that made him look wiser and better than anybody. He looked as young or old as anybody grown up, and after that first wonderful outbreak he took to Bensington and Redwood and the food of the gods with such a convincing air of proprietorship, that at times, in spite of the testimony of the press to the contrary, Bensington was disposed to regard him as the original inventor of the whole affair. "These accidents," said Winkles, when Bensington hinted at the dangers of further escapes, "are nothing. The discovery is everything. Properly developed, suitably handled, sanely controlled, we have something very portentous indeed in this food of ours. We must keep our eye on it. We mustn't let it out of control again, and we mustn't let it rest." He certainly did not mean to do that. He was at Bensington's now almost every day. Bensington, glancing from the window, would see the faultless equipage come spanking up Sloane Street, and after an incredibly brief interval Winkles would enter the room with a light, strong motion, and pervade it, and protrude some newspapers and supply information, and make remarks. "Well," he would say, rubbing his hands, "how are we getting on?" and so pass to the current discussion about it. "Do you see," he would say, for example, "that Caterham has been talking about our stuff at the Church Association?" "Dear me!" said Bensington, "that's a cousin of the Prime Minister, isn't it?" "Yes," said Winkles, "a very able young man, very able. Quite wrong headed, you know, violent reactionary, but thoroughly able, and he's